Hey, nice to have you back. We're going to talk about human capital today. Human capital is a kind of an odd term. We're talking about the valuable resources that come from having people, staff organizations, the skills and the traits that they bring, and how we manage them and help them improve. At the same time, provide leadership for them and career development. Uh, when we start thinking about organizations are staffed by people, and we want to keep and retain the best people. So I thought, why do people really quit their jobs? Is it because they don't like the work environment? They don't like the compensation? They don't like their boss? There's no growth potential? Or is there something else? A lot of human resource officers ask that question all the time. And unions will say, or some faculty members like me will say, well, it's a compensation, we're not paid enough. Some of them will say, well, we have a hostile work environment, whatever. But when we look across all sorts of organizations, the number one reason people quit their jobs is because their manager. They will stay in horrible jobs if their manager has their back. They will leave immediately. They'll leave great jobs if their manager is untrustworthy or not helpful to them. So management really matters in trying to develop the right skills and the right people. So how do we do that? How do we develop a strategy that thinks about recruiting and retaining the best workers to provide goods and services that they need and make sure that the programs are run well? This is a massive problem, especially at the state and local levels. Especially the local levels. How do we develop these really, really talented people into a position that they can grow into? And how do we worry about that? Well, at the local level, it's actually a little bit easier than at maybe the state or the federal level. Because at the federal level, we have noted that there's massive problems not actually managing the potential of these individuals. Now, why is that? Well, I don't know. We have new skills that are being developed and needed all the time. And we find that the General Accountability Office said there are like gaps in these critical organizations, these critical areas. Why is that? Well, some of it is we haven't developed a very good strategy. There's a story from President Reagan when the Air Traffic Controller Union struck. He said you don't have the right to strike, and they struck. They fired all those people who struck, these air traffic controllers. Well, about 30 years later, nobody had planned to replace them, and they started to, the human resources officers started to try to figure out how they're going to replace new air traffic controllers because nobody had thought about the fact they all got hired at the same time. They'd all likely retire about the same time. Like, how silly is that? Well, it just didn't happen. They didn't think about it. So we've got to figure out better ways to recruit the best people, keep the best people. We'll talk about some of those potential problems. Well, it starts with leadership. That's to say, we have to find people who are committed to building human capital. In organizations that I work in, I keep thinking about, like, if I am the leader, how am I going to find my replacement? How am I going to empower those people around me so they can do their job when I'm gone? Now that flies in the face of a lot of thinking, and especially in the private sector, where if someone can do your job better than you, they'll fire you and take that person. Well, it doesn't exactly work that way inside organizations, but really, at least public organizations, but really we have to think about how to grow individuals using their skills and talents and traits, give them new opportunities to work. Well, here's the problem. We have a lot of rules. When we talked about the civil service system, we talked about people having a very specific position classification. That means they had a set of roles and responsibilities that they were not supposed to exceed. How do we, match that up with giving them opportunities to grow? Well, we have to figure out some sort of reform to allow them to do jobs outside of their position description. Well, how do we do that? Because we don't want to give them jobs where they're going to fail. Because if we give individuals jobs outside of their position classification, and set them up to fail, it looks like we're trying to fire them. So we've got to figure out ways to work within the system to do that. We have a real weakness in recruiting the best talent, developing them and retaining them. Why is that? Well, some of it is some high ethical requirements to work in public service. Some of it is that it's not very interesting or sexy to come and work for government. In fact, there's a city in Orange County nearby that has a really, really hard time hiring a specific ethnic group from the community that they serve. So that ethnic group is very, very prominent in that community, and they have 0 police officers of that race or ethnicity. And we think, well, why? Well, because it's not a high status job. But we want to be able to have police officers who can interact with that community and speak their language and have a familiar face. Well, it's not a high status job. It doesn't pay super well, and so people don't come into those positions. And we've for a long time emphasized rules and forms instead of sort of the results that people can bring to any organization. If we go all the way back to delegated authority, public organizations do the work of government. They do have delegated authority to them. They have to use that authority properly. Well, they can only do the things that they've been given power to do. In the private organizations, they can do whatever they want. But in public organizations, we can only do what we've been given power to do. That means it stifles innovative thinking because it forces us to do what we've been given power to do instead of thinking about new ways to do that. So the federal government we're talking about federal level, but this has sort of happened at the state and local levels. We have the Office of Personnel Management. Those are the human resources for all the federal government. The Office of Management and Budget inside the Office of the President, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. They have all tried to figure out ways to get better, to recruit more good employees, to keep employees, to give them opportunities to grow. President George W. Bush made a central part of his management agenda, identify ways to grow human capital. Under President Clinton, they changed some of the rules and forms about how you'd have to apply for a job that were like 6 feet long and streamlined that process. President Obama did similar things, got rid of some hiring rules, and we're trying to figure out ways to recruit good employees to come and serve in the federal government. Actually, the state and local levels too. Some of the things that we've been able to do is that elected officials have given some agencies exemptions from the civil service law, where we had these really, really tight rules and procedures for how we hired people, how we promoted people. Some agencies have been given waivers, like the FAA, the IRS, Department of Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs. There's all sorts of these different ways that we can sort of modify or change the civil service system, remove some of those protections. But in removing the protections, we open up some freedoms. So we have these trade-offs. You have to give up something in the civil service in order to get something. And we give up a little bit of our protections against political influence or nepotism or something like that so that we can hire better people. So lawmakers have to give power to those agencies to do that, which means we also have to convince lawmakers that that's an important part of government function. So on state level, we've done this a couple of times. For example, Texas in the 80s abolished the merit council. Agencies were given a lot more flexibility in hiring and firing. They abolished the state merit system, had employees serve at will. So what happens in an at-will system is that you could be fired at any time. So under the civil service system, it took having to prove that you weren't performing your job very well in order to fire you. Well, at-will employment, you get rid of those protections, and there's really no recourse. They found that Georgia, this was they were at the cutting edge of management, innovation, and capacity. So we have this trade-off. We give up a little bit of protection, maybe we get some innovation. Florida made similar changes, and when we talk about Texas, Florida, Georgia, they've relatively had no problems. All these people predicted lots of political interference and instability in the system. They haven't really seen that. They haven't seen widespread abuse. So we gotta, there may be some tweaks that we can make to the civil service system that gives us some of our time-honored protections to allow us to grow and retain and recruit people. When we talked about grade creep in the last chapter, we talked about having agencies essentially create new positions for people in order to pay them more money. Well, maybe that's not necessary. Maybe we just have to sort of pull out some of the guts of the civil service system so we can give flexibility in pay raises and adding new job responsibilities to them. We do worry about abuse, but at least in these 3 cases, we haven't seen a lot of that. What we need to do is that we need to have leaders who are committed to fixing these agencies, thinking long-term strategically about who we need to hire, how we need to hire them. And we've tried to figure out how to do that, how to foster an environment that recruits and retains and rewards its top performers. Instead of just sort of checking the box, I'm here on time, looking for ways that public employees actually engage in the system, that they perform well. We already talked about this, but performance management is really hard, trying to figure out if an employee is doing a good job. Thinking of new ways to deal with that. Now, interestingly, I think we talked about this before, states as laboratories of innovation. States and local governments have fewer employees working in crucial functions. I think about local governments in the Orange County area. they might have a small staff, and one staff member, like an assistant city manager or head of public works, might have to do a whole bunch of different jobs that they wouldn't have to do otherwise. And so we have to figure out how to breed an environment of success for that person, but then also manage them well and reward them. And that's not always easy. We don't just sort of throw out bonuses like you would if you worked at some manufacturing company for producing a certain number of widgets. We have rules about not being able to provide bonuses in that way. And there would be some ethical concerns about giving a bonus to, say, a teacher who has all of their students pass all the exams really well. That's largely dependent on the parents of those people, less upon the teacher. So we've got to figure out some of that stuff. And in order to get good leaders, we have to have strong political leadership. Political leadership at the top of the federal bureaucracy, at least, is a remnant of the patronage system. There's about 3,000 of those positions. 1,500 of those are at the highest levels of government. We're talking about ambassadors. We're talking about heads of departments, Department of Homeland Security, Transportation, cabinet level officials. We have so many of these people at the top of the bureaucracy, more than many Western democracies do. And in fact, Paul Light said, he said, there are layers and layers of leaders at each level that, we can figure out how to tweak that a little bit. The idea here is that we have leaders in these agencies who will be responsive to executive direction, like from the president. But those leaders don't always think about long-term strategies for their replacements, because they can be replaced at any time. And so we need committed leaders who can focus on human capital. This is a really, really difficult test, especially for a new president. So imagine a president gets elected, then they've got to staff 3,000 people. But they all have to go through background checks. They all have to go through being vetted. They have to be approved by the Senate, so the Senates have to hold hearings. It takes, on average, about 10 months to get a person through that really difficult process. And they're talking about looking at old tax returns. They're talking about if they've ever hired an illegal immigrant to clean their house. They're looking for super clean records, and the Senate will sort of pounce on people who don't have that record. We're also looking for individuals who have lots of leadership or experience managing that type of organization. We're talking about huge organizations like the Department of Defense. Holy cow! So a lot of these people who we put in these positions lack experience. They don't really have management experience. Maybe they have topical expertise, but largely these people end up being politicians who've run Senate campaigns, or maybe they're governors. Very rarely do we pull from the private sector to run, the Department of Interior. Department of Interior manages leases for federal contracts for land. Who would want that? Well, maybe an energy executive or an oil and gas executive. So there's some questions about whether or not that's okay to have an energy executive come and run government service that they'll now have access to grant more leases to their friends. So there's a lot of these concerns, and they're going to be under significant scrutiny. If you're talking about appointing somebody in the Department of Justice, for example, like an attorney general, they're going to look at all their legal background and their legal cases and how they've ruled on stuff. They're going to ask them questions that are, pretty personal. So why would anybody want these jobs? Well, there's a couple reasons. Most of these people want their jobs to parlay them into something else. So a political leader at the highest levels of government will want to establish networks. They'll want to establish, some good rapport with the people they interact with, maybe hit a couple, key milestones or goals, and then they're going to move on. And that's one of the biggest problems. They move on because they know that presidents do dumb things. All presidents do dumb things, but presidents are elected for 4 years. They might get to serve 8. But presidents if they've served 8 years, in the 7th, 8th year, they start doing things that they wouldn't normally do. And if you were a political appointee working for that president, your legacy is tied to what that president does. So they spend 10 months trying to get through the process. They get in and they start working. They try to have a couple wins, things that they are able to bring back to the people that they're serving, but also to put on their resume. And then they start moving on. They move on because presidents do dumb things, because that work environment is not familiar to them. They've established their networks and they're using that job to get somewhere else. So what happens at these top levels of leadership, these political appointees are trying to figure out how to make their name better. And instead of turning around and trying to help engender leadership from below, they're often out for themselves. And those people at the lower levels look up at these leaders and they say, well, look, you guys don't care about me. You're going to be here 2 years. You're going to serve, about 2 years, and then you're going to be gone. So why am I going to obey you? Why am I going to do the things that you want me to do and you're not really investing in me?